Mr. Tall. Mr. Tall was very, very, very tall. Quite the tallest person you've ever met. In fact, quite the tallest person you've never met, because you've never met anybody with legs as long as Mr. Tall's legs, have you? There's Mr. Tall. Now, the problem with being as tall as Mr. Tall meant that life was just one long problem, as you can see. Oh dear, he used to sigh. Oh dear me. I do wish that my legs weren't quite as very, very, very long. He decided to go for a walk to think things over his problem. He was just stepping over a tree when he heard a voice, a little voice. Hello. There he is, stepping over a tree. It was Mr. Small, standing underneath a daisy. But Mr. Tall was so tall he couldn't see him. So Mr. Small shouted at the top of his voice, "Hello!" A Mr. Small shout is about as loud as a bee sneeze. There he is, yelling away. So it took quite some time for Mr. Tall to spot him. "Oh," he said gloomily, "it's you." "Why don't you look very happy?" said Mr. Small. "What's up?" "I am," replied Mr. Tall, "because of these silly long legs of mine." "Oh," said Mr. Small. There they are, talking away. Mr. Small decided to cheer him up. "Let's go for a walk together," he suggested. So they did, which of course didn't work. It was like a giraffe going for a walk with a mouse. Then Mr. Small had an idea, which did work. He sat on his head and went for a walk with him. And because the length of Mr. Tall's legs, they very quickly walked all the way to the seaside. "Come for a swim," cried Mr. Small. "Can't," replied Mr. Tall. "By the time it gets deep enough for me to swim, I'll be at the other side." See, there they are. So Mr. Small went for a swim, while Mr. Tall sat down with a face which was nearly as long as his legs. He doesn't look very happy. Mr. Tickle came along. "Hello," he said. "You look as if you need cheering up. Care for a tickle?" "No, thanks," replied Mr. Tall. "What I would care for are some different legs. Mine are much too long." There's Mr. Tickle trying to tickle him. "So are my arms," said Mr. Tickle cheerfully, "but all the better for tickling." And off he went, chuckling, looking for someone to tickle. Looking for anybody to tickle with his long arms. Mr. Nosy came along. "Cheer up," he said. "You look very down in the mouth. What's the problem?" "It's my legs," said Mr. Tall. "They're too long." And there's Mr. Nosy with his big nose. "So's my nose," replied Mr. Nosy, laughing. "But for all the better for poking into other people's business." And off he went, looking for something to be nosy about. Looking for anything to be nosy about. That's a big nose. Mr. Greedy came along. "Hello," he cried. "You look gloomy. What's wrong?" "It's my legs," explained Mr. Tall. "They're too big." There they are, chatting away. "So's my tummy," replied Mr. Greedy, "but all the better for filling with food," and went off licking his lips. He's a hungry Mr. Greedy. Mr. Tall sat and thought about Mr. Tickle's arms, Mr. Nosy's nose, Mr. Greedy's tummy. He smiled, and then he grinned, and then he laughed out loud. He looked at his legs, those very, very, very long legs of his. All the better for walking, he chuckled, and walked home. In 4 minutes, 40 miles. There he is, walking along, happy as can be. Mr. Small came out of the sea after a short swim. And how am I going to get home, he asked himself. So he set off walking. All the way home, 40 miles. That was last year. And there he is, slowly walking along because he's small. He got home yesterday. The end. All right, sweetie, you have a good night. Sweet dreams. Daddy loves you. Be good for mummy.